I think that time I got reincarnated as a slime is an anime that finally taught me what anticlimactic means. For me, it didn't invent the feeling because I felt it in other anime before. I just never knew how to describe it. I'd finish certain fights and sit there for a second and think, I really thought that was going to go differently. And then I'd move on. I'd never stopped enjoying the anime, and I never thought the writing was bad. I just had this feeling that I couldn't quite put into words. Then one day I heard someone describe a fight as anticlimactic, and I remember thinking, wait, that's exactly it. That word perfectly describes something I've been feeling for years. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized the fights weren't actually the problem. I think I misunderstood what the story was trying to make me feel. When we watch anime, we've been conditioned to expect a certain payoff. The villain gets built up, everybody talks about how dangerous they are, the stakes keep rising, then the hero finally shows up, struggles, pushes past their limits, and barely pulls out a victory. That's the kind of climax I was expecting. So whenever Slime spent episodes building up a villain, my brain automatically started preparing for that kind of battle. I was waiting for the impossible fight. The one where Rimuru would have to give everything he had just to survive. But then Slime would do something that completely caught me off guard. The fight would start, and before I really had time to settle in, it was over. I felt like maybe the story was treating the fight like the beginning of the next arc. And this is probably the biggest realization I had while making this video. Rimuru usually becomes stronger long before I realized the enemy isn't actually a threat anymore. That changed everything for me, because while I'm watching the story asking, can Rimuru win? The story already answered that question episodes ago. It already knows he can win. Now it's asking something completely differently. What changes after Rimuru wins? How does the world react? How does Tempest grow? How do other nations respond? What new responsibilities does Rimuru have now? The fight isn't always the climax, and sometimes it's just confirmation that the story has already entered a new phase. Once that clicked, I stopped looking at those fights the same way. Clayman is probably the perfect example. Think back to everything leading up to Wild Progress. Clayman had been manipulating events from the shadows for a long time. He was pulling strings behind multiple conflicts, controlling people, and making himself feel like this mastermind that Rimuru would eventually have to overcome. Then Wild Progress happens, and every demon lord is gathered together. The political tension is through the roof, Clayman is finally exposed, and everything about this setup tells you this is Rimuru's biggest challenge yet. At least that's what I believe. Then the fight starts, and Rimuru didn't even fight him, he let his underlings do. The first time I watched it, I remember thinking, wait, that's it? After all that build-up? But looking back, I realized something. The story wasn't trying to convince me Clayman was Rimuru's equal. It was showing me that Rimuru had already surpassed him. Clayman wasn't the mountain, he was a sign that Rimuru had already climbed it. The actual payoff wasn't the fight, it was everyone at Wild Progress realizing exactly who Rimuru had become. I think the Falmuth arc might have been the moment the storytelling became the clearest too. They did all that, manipulated him. Many of the Tempest citizens died. 20,000 soldiers marched towards Tempest. I'm thinking this is going to be a massive war just for them to be wiped out with ease. So the payoff there I think was Rimuru making the impossible decision to become a demon lord. The instance where I noticed something anticlimactic in other anime is when Rimuru versus Gyoko in Demon Slayer. I remember seeing so many people say upper rank 5 went down way too easy. And I understood people. I honestly feel like Gyoko didn't have necessarily a build-up, it was more so the fact that he's an upper rank. And that's a build-up of its own. So you're gonna expect one of the hardest fights in the series because again, that's pretty much what have been presented to us before. But then Rimuru wins much faster than people expected. And so I think our expectations were just behind the story. I feel like Gyoko wasn't weaker than we thought. Rimuru was just much stronger than we realized. And that's almost exactly how Slime made me feel. And so now when I catch myself finishing a fight and thinking, I expected more, I don't want to immediately blame the story anymore. Maybe I'll stop and ask if the story was actually building toward the fight, or was it building toward everything that happened because of the fight? Because those aren't always the same thing. Sometimes the fight is the climax, but sometimes the fight is just confirmation that the real climax already happened. But until next time, sail safe and stay spirited.